There we go.
All right. Well, today, I guess, I don't know. I usually start these off by introducing someone, but I don't usually have Benjamin along. So today I'm joined by Benjamin Boyce and Melanie Bennet. And Melanie, you are a Canadian mother and podcaster, and we are glad to be able to speak with you. It's such an interesting time we're finding ourselves in the world. And just before we hit record, we were talking about your son and his friend group, and I've noticed this youth culture around gender has really changed quite a lot. And even if your kid is not trans identified, probably a lot of their friends are, and so this is something that they're steeped in and really familiar with. And it, to those of us who are in the older generation, it can seem really strange and new. So what maybe could you start by telling a little bit about how you found yourself doing this work and what you've discovered since you've been doing it?
That's quite a story. I actually moved. I'm originally Canadian, but I lived in the UK all my adult life, and I moved back to the UK, back to Canada in 2017 for a job. I was actually trying to escape Brexit at the time, so not to give it too much away, but I am an ex-progressive liberal, a very, very progressive liberal. Anyway, so I moved to Canada for this job into the Greater Toronto area, and my son was grade 9. He was starting grade 9, which is high school here, and yeah, I'd noticed something a bit off almost immediately, but I knew Toronto had a bit of a reputation for being cold, so I didn't think too much of it. And so I just carried on, did my job in a very progressive sort of job, noticed some kind of funny things there too. But again, carried on. Anyway, that didn't go too well for about 6 years. But through that period, my son had a lot of trans friends and a lot of, LGBT grouping friends. And nothing occurred to me as being funny in that, because why would it at all? And it wasn't until one of his friends, who is male to female, moved into my home, I found out this kid wasn't living with their parents. There were some issues there. And so I said, okay, they can live with us. And that's how I came across what trans really means to young people. And through that experience, I was awoken to a lot of issues. In fact, that's how I came across Benjamin Boyce, who helped me a lot to understand some of the young people as well, because I was seeing things that did not make any sense to me whatsoever. That's how I learned what a TERF was. Anyway, so down the line, after about a year of trying to figure out what the problem is, reading some school policies, reading some literature, actually, some academic literature on some of these topics in Canada, what's going on in schools, I felt like I had to do something. I felt like I had to say something. And the whole time I was in the Canada here in the GTA, I didn't really have a group of friends. So I was kind of on my own dealing with all this. It was very intimidating for me to be like, okay, I need to say something. But I knew that saying something would potentially result in cancellation or all these things that you see happening to people. So I braced myself for the worst. Turns out the worst didn't happen. And I went to a protest on June 9th in Ottawa, which is about 5 hours away from where I am, with Billboard Chris. He arranged this protest in Ottawa outside of his school, one where he originally did a few years before with Chanel Fall and Shannon Boucher a few years ago. Anyway, so this protest was huge. It was a big event. I ended up going. Year? It was, it was last year. So June 9th, 23. And as soon as I got there, I just made a beeline for whoever looked friendly, whoever looked like they might know something. And I met a person who runs an account called Blueprint for Canada. I didn't know at the time. I ended up meeting Shannon that day. I ended up meeting Julia Malotte, Chanel Fall, lots and lots of Canadians who've been speaking out and I didn't mention, actually, I've been off social media for over 10 years, like a long time. And I joined Twitter like a month before I went to this protest. So I was sort of aware of these people, but not really. And that just led to having lots of conversations. I joined up with a group called Our Duty Canada, which is a parents group here in Canada. It's a group that supports parents of children who identify as trans and who are they're struggling. The parents are silenced. The parents are treated really horribly by the school system, by our government, by other parents. So anyway, I joined this group and I thought, I kind of knew I wasn't really cancelable. So I put myself forward to be a face for the organization. I would have anonymous interviews with some of these, with the parents, basically trying to get their stories out. Because what I was hearing was really horrible. And a lot of the stories matched up quite a lot. So I did that for a while. And then I joined Shannon Boucher on the Canadian Gender Wars report, the weekly Canadian Gender Wars report, where we do a couple things. We talk about what's new in gender in Canada, because a lot of this stuff is not covered by our media, or it's a complete lie. Like, for example, found out recently that CSIS, our FBI, has put Canadians' parents' rights groups on a watch list for being terrorists, right? So they're not really getting a true reflection of what's going on. So we try to talk about what's new in the media in Canada and gender. And I come from an academic background, so I took the opportunity to do a few videos examining some of the literature, the pedagogical literature, queer pedagogy in Canada, and how that's manifesting in our schools. So that's kind of how I came to kind of talking to you today, really.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that you moved back to Canada from the UK in 2017, and it was quite a culture shock, it sounds like, seeing how, I guess, woke or whatever it had gotten. What was that like?
Well, I was aware of the term woke,
Mm-hmm.
and it was certainly obvious that there was a woke attack on comedy in the UK. I didn't pay too much attention to it. Like I said, I wasn't on social media. I come from a very champagne socialist sort of environment, highly educated, you know, but not on social media, avoiding all these things, very much in an echo chamber. And moving to Canada really kind of, but I'll say that it's not, I don't think at that time, certainly, even though I lived in one of the, possibly the most far left cities in the UK, in Bristol. Bristol is, I mean, Antifa's all over the place. And I didn't even really, I noticed some red flags, but I didn't really pay attention to it. But it wasn't, but even in the workplace, like, I didn't feel cancellation if you could speak your mind. It certainly hadn't taken over in the UK, even though I was slightly aware of some of this stuff. So it was easy to say this stuff is exaggerated. It's not really a thing. Maybe it's just an exaggeration, right? So moving to Canada, not really having a group, and sort of facing that head on, both in my job and at home, although I didn't quite understand that's what was going on at home, but I noticed a change in my son's behavior within months. But also the people that I would sort of encounter. And so, yeah, it was a shock. I didn't quite understand it for many, many, many years, though. I mean, now it's quite clear. But I mean, I remember having a conversation with my son's father. We're divorced. We haven't been together in a while, but we always had a really, really good relationship. We've maintained a very good friendship over the years. And I remember telling him very early on, possibly within weeks or a month or two, that something felt off, that I couldn't put my finger on it, but something is a bit off. And I even remember having a conversation with him recently about that early conversation, that something was a bit off. And you know, see, in the UK, the general reaction I have from that is, again, the reaction I had: you're just exaggerating. It's not really a thing. You know, is woke even real? You know, so I think a lot of people in the UK still possibly not seeing some of these things, but a lot of people in Canada, I think, maybe still fully haven't figured out what's going on.
Are you able to see it? And what are you seeing? Like, if you're able to detect this thing that we're calling wokeness, just for the sake of brevity in this conversation, like, what are its characteristics?
So to be clear, I don't come across a lot of this stuff in my day-to-day life, because I'm no longer part of I no longer work in an industry that is driven by any DEI. So I used to be in a very kind of academic field, which I'm no longer. So I don't actually encounter it. I now work for tradesmen, so I don't see it at all in my day-to-day life. But the kind of thing I'm talking about is, so let's give an example. So I now speak to, I've gotten to meet a lot of people. And a lot of these people are teachers, they're parents, they are journalists or lawyers, people who are trying to fight back against some of these DEI policies. And each one of them has stories. So one of the things, like, why aren't teachers speaking out? Well, when I speak to these teachers, it's because they have policies in place in schools where if you say something, you can face consequences with the teacher college or the regulating body for those teachers. And so there are very, very real consequences for sharing an opinion that is not in line with what you're supposed to say and do. As an example, Amy Ham very recently had a trial because she put up a billboard with Billboard Chris, and I think it was I love. Why can't I remember her name?
I heart J.K. Rowling.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And so that's been a big kerfuffle for many years. And during and by putting that up and not taking it back, I guess this person's been, or Amy Ham's been put through a few years of problems with the College of Nurses, right? So that's another example of this woke. So you have this line that you're supposed to follow, and if you don't toe the line, then you will face real consequences. And then there's other consequences. So other people around you might be seeing the same thing, so they're also silent. So in the workplace, people might not be, honest about what they actually truly feel about things. I mean, how else do you want to describe it? So I don't encounter it much, well, almost at all in real life. I did encounter, I guess, some of this like woke stuff when you go to a public protest or anything like that. Like June 9th was full of that stuff. You see Antifa people, you see, people with flags calling you bigots and all kinds of stuff. But yeah, it's a strange situation because there's this sort of like overarching oppressive force, it feels like. And everyone kind of knows that there's opinions you're supposed to have and opinions that you're not supposed to have. And you can't really explain what's holding you back, but something's holding you back. And that stopped me speaking out for a really long time. So maybe I'm not explaining this very well, but there's certainly, I think the vast majority of people don't agree with some of these extreme race policies or some of these extreme like policies promoting trans kids and stuff like that. But they go along with it because for a lot of people, they don't really have a choice.
Why would they not have a choice?
I don't know the exact number, but in Canada, I think the biggest employer is the public sector. So the public sector is very, very, so there's a lot of unions in the public sector. And those unions represent working class interests, but also it's very much about social justice. And so you kind of have to toe the line. If you don't toe the line, you could face a consequence, and then your union is not going to represent you. So that's one example. Can you ask me the question again?
Well, it's just I was kind of pushing against the assumption that people don't have a choice.
Well,
That
okay,
just
they
sounds
feel, I think,
at this
okay, so
point
this
in
is the thing.
time after 7 years and this, I'm like, shit or get off the pot. Pardon my Canadian.
I'm going to go ahead and agree with you because
Yeah.
this is a feeling that people have. So I'm expressing how a lot of people feel because when I speak to them, that's overarching. I had that feeling before I started saying something, right? But I also know that I won't face consequences. My employers are actually quite pleased with what I do, even though we don't talk about it at work. They pat me on the back and say, well done. So I know that I won't face consequences. I haven't faced public consequences for having a podcast. But many, many, many people very strongly feel that they will face consequence, especially the teachers that I speak to. So the people who are most likely to face consequences are actually people like journalists, lawyers, teachers, right? Now, we can argue whether or not they should be braver and actually do something about it. Like, that is true. But the fact of the matter is they will. And then for the rest of the population who maybe are working class and maybe not in, laptop jobs, a lot of them do speak out, and our own government talks about them like they're fascists and Nazis and bigots. Our prime minister so last year we had the Million March for Children, right? I don't know if you're aware of those, but all over Canada, there were protests which are organized locally amongst lots of different groups. They were predominantly parents who had concerns over what was going on in schools, who I wouldn't say spontaneously protested, but it was very like grassroots organized. And our prime minister actually came out and essentially called these parents, I can't remember exactly what he called them, but basically called them fascists, right?
Very bad people.
Exactly.
He did reel that
So
back in. It's like, I under no circumstance meant actual parents. The next day, I think he got some pushback, and
yeah,
he kind of reeled it back in, but he still came out and said that.
yeah. I mean, even well, there was a recording of him speaking to some Muslim parents who were concerned about some of this stuff in schools, and he was trying to tell them that they were being misled by American right-wing misinformation about what goes on.
Snippy, snippy.
Mm.
It's like a MAGA fever dream that kids are being castrated and drugged into sterility.
Yeah. So, I mean, what I'm saying is there are very real forces that so you
Yeah.
can understand why people might feel this way.
Yeah.
Now, I would
No,
agree
I do.
with
Yeah.
you that people need to grow a bit of a backbone. And I'm becoming less able to contain that sentiment. But I understand why they feel like that.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
Uh,
the problem is that them not speaking up makes it more and more inevitable that this stuff continues to encroach and infiltrate and take over, and
yeah.
that authoritarian kind of zeitgeist that you feel becomes more and more concretized, the more and more people accept it. The problem with Canada is that you guys don't have a strong right wing. Like, we have some fuck
No.
you spirit still in America, and we can be called fascist and put on watch lists, and we still go and do it. We're a huge country. The government, although it is huge and the most powerful entity on this planet, probably in history, is still unable to completely contain us, and we have a lot more wiggle room. The Canada, I mean, your right wing is like basically left wing uh, to
Yeah.
us, and you guys are very polite. Just the demeanor, you guys are very community oriented. There's a really interesting way of reading Canada history where our government was very small and our populace was very individualistic, and we were frontiersmen. We went out and we have this individualist kind of just a myth in our culture that we are the individuals, we are the pioneers. In Canada, the way that nature was much more severe there, you had the government more strong to support people, Mounties and the community, because it was much harder to survive up there. So there's much more of a socialist or communal spirit up there. And so you guys, it's more natural that you guys went along a path of socialization with your Medicare, with these unions. It's more like a together spirit. But now that that together spirit has been infected by this communist, this Maoist, this really tight progressive ideology, it's really hard for people to fight against that. There's less wiggle room, and there's more of a sense of, yeah, it's just Canadians are nice, and this stuff is particularly suited to weaponize niceness.
Yeah. I spent most of my life in the UK, and
Yeah,
I agree with you. I'm like, where's the people? So
yeah,
British people are much more uh, skeptical of their governments, right? I certainly developed a lot of cynicism about government in the UK. I can't
hmm,
speak as a Canadian, even though I have a Canadian passport, because culturally speaking, I really haven't spent most of my life here. So I sometimes have the same struggles that as you talk about here. I don't understand why people are not more willing to come out. But that said, I mean, look, I've Canada's a village. Despite all that, Canada really is a village. And me coming out of nowhere, not having any friends, um, going to a protest and meeting some people randomly that I made a beeline for, I was able to develop a network of people who is a very small group who are very, very active behind the scenes. A lot of them are not
yeah,
speaking publicly the way that I am because they
okay,
can't. But they're
sure,
using this network to try to get some of this stuff published in the media to affect change in some of the policies, try to just try to make those changes. And they're really, really, really dedicated. So I would agree with you that a lot a lot of people see problems here in Canada and will complain about them and maybe be the keyboard warrior about it and not do anything. But the small group of people who are actually trying to make a difference, I think actually been very, very, very effective. I wish it was more. I really do.
Yeah.
But I've
You,
seen a
you
very
guys are
different
not
side to
afforded the
Canada.
protections that we're afforded with regard to
No,
speech.
and that's a problem.
Yeah.
That is a very big problem. Very recently, Jordan Peterson had a conversation with, why are names going out my head? I'll come back to that. But yes, one of the pardon?
McGilchrist, he had a
Lawyer Bruce
picture.
Pardy. There you go. Came back to my head. I'm
the
having
guy with
problems
the
with names
chest
today.
hair and the
No,
like the
Bruce
cult
Pardy
guy.
is one of our legal academics, and he speaks out against woke stuff, and he's done many panels. And anyway, so he had a conversation with Jordan Peterson recently talking about some of the legal issues that we have in Canada. And yes, your constitution, I think, is probably one of the things holding the West together. I never, as a Canadian and a Brit who put down America for all these years, like, oh, they think they're so great. And I'm like, well, actually, you guys maybe are the ones holding up Western values. But anyway, part of the problem with the laws in Canada, he called them agile, right? So they're sort of chopping and changing as you go along, sort of agile management, as you know, like in IT. And I thought that's a really good way of describing Canadian law right now, is that it's being interpreted as you want it to be interpreted, or as the legal system wants to be interpreted. And don't forget, our legal colleges are woke, right? Our judges are woke. And so recently there was a case, I'm no legal scholar, but I know legally there was a legal case recently that questioned, somebody brought to the courts that they were discriminated against as a white person. And was it illegal to discriminate against a white person? And the answer was no, because you're white. And so the power and privilege idea of racism in Canada, that's now a precedent within the law. And don't forget, this is not state by state in the same way. This kind of applies broadly, right?
Amazing. I like the one where the guy wants a penis and a vagina, and for government to pay for the penis and the vagina. And he just won his case, so he gets both. And you guys have to pay for it.
We have
Actually, you have to pay
it.
for him to fly down to
Like
America,
to Texas.
or to get it happen to him.
Yeah.
Great.
Well, I think it was yesterday I saw that the Trudeau Liberals unveiled their plan to build the world's first like 2S LGBTQIA++ monument in Ottawa.
Monument. Yeah.
So
It's great.
I don't know. I do wonder what the rest of the world sees, because okay, so my family in the UK currently think I'm crazy. They think I have become, so again, like I said, I used to be a progressive leftist my entire life, and I was very much in those circles. But now that I started realizing these problems and kind of trying to explain it to friends and family, I've now been labeled as a right-wing extremist. In fact, funny story, last Christmas, I got a book. Have you read, what is it called? Doppelganger from Naomi Klein. The premise of the book is there are two Naomis. There's Naomi Wolf and Naomi Klein. And Naomi Klein is writing about how she gets confused from Naomi Wolf, who used to be a progressive leftist, but then became a crazy right-wing conspiracy theorist through COVID. So this is the book that I received at Christmas.
Wow.
Okay.
So
did you read it? Was it self-reflexive? Was it kind of poking a hole in the progressive holier than thou attitude?
No, it's basically saying, why did she become crazy? Why is she crazy now? She used to be one of us. Why is she crazy now?
Yeah.
So this is kind of the sentiment that I feel that I'm getting from old friends and family. And I do
does
wonder,
that affect you negatively, or you just chill with that? Or
I'm
do you
not chill
even
with
get
it.
some energy from being?
No, that was the last thing I thought would happen, to be fair. But I made a mistake when I was learning about these things. I just went straight to saying, oh, this is what I'm learning, right? And I realized now that's a mistake. You don't do that. That wouldn't have worked on me. And the only reason that I woke up is, so this is one thing I've realized. So many people who I know are liberals, ex-left-leaning people. I even know some NDP, which is our Communist Party, defectors over this trans issue. And one of the common things across the board, whether you're a parent or not, is that you need to be shaken out of it because it's affected you deeply on a personal level. Now, as a parent, that's obvious, because if it's your kid and you realize that some of these things are not what they're sold as, that makes sense. But for some people, it's maybe it happened to a friend, or maybe they got canceled, right? So there seems to be this common thread of some kind of something that knocks you out of your previous way of thinking. Now, see, my family haven't had that yet. I don't think, although this is growing in the UK, I just don't think it's reached the same level. And some people are definitely, and the other thing about being on the left is that they often talk about this echo chamber. And I really believed that everyone on the right, they're in an echo chamber. And surely that's possibly true. We're all sort of in an echo chamber. But as someone who got knocked out of mine and started accepting wider ideas or trying to listen to a more diverse viewpoints, it's become obvious to me that if you're on the left, you're probably in a much tighter echo chamber. And it's very, very, very difficult to try to get out of that. And so coming at someone with facts, and telling them that you found this information, there's always a way around of justifying why that's just a crazy idea, or that's misinformation, or it's always something, right? Like it's very, very difficult to kind of get through to people unless something happens. I hesitate to use the word trauma, but almost like something traumatic that kind of knocks you out of it, right?
Yeah, I like that phrase, knocks you out of it. And what was it for you that because you described this kind of culture shock, and then noticing some things were different, like your son would have been a young teen at that time, I think. What, 14-ish, 15, something like that?
Yeah, he was 14.
So was it that the youth culture seemed different? Was it something from his teachers? Was it that you were starting to observe?
Hey, listen, I noticed red flags since the 2010s, if I'm really honest, but I dismissed them. This is what I'm saying. Like, you can notice red flags when you're in the echo chamber, but you will dismiss them. And I did that a really long time. And when we moved to Canada, again, red flags all the time, dismiss them. What really did it for me was being disconnected. I think it's two things. One, being disconnected from everyone I knew, right? I was here alone in Canada. I didn't really have familial relationships. I struggled to make friends. And so there was a disconnection. So I was on my own. And the second one was my son's friend who moved in. Because when I started having those conversations, this is where I discovered that, well, first of all, this kid was autistic. And I found out later that that's actually quite common. But beyond that, being told that taking pills literally turns you into a female, and if you say anything, then you're a bigot. Those kinds of things, for some reason, there was something about that. And the more that I had discussions, the more I got called all kinds of names. But the funny thing is, it wasn't spat out in hatred. It was like, oh, that's okay, because you're a TERF. Anyway, and to carry on the conversation. It was a very strange experience. And so I just felt, I think the actual thing that woke me up was finding out that this kid at 16 years old was encouraged by the school to go to the doctor, and the doctor gave them cross-sex hormones and it was cross-sex hormones and androgen blockers without parental consent. And even though they offered medical psychological assessment, he declined it. And so we had whole conversations along, well, whatever happened to the Hippocratic Oath? I had many conversations with this kid that just didn't seem right to me. And then investigating that online and allowing myself to listen to different viewpoints, hearing the same sorts of stories all over the place. That I think that's what did it for me. There was something wrong there.
When you are talking about how is Canada perceived, I think it's really interesting. It's been from my perspective, when during the Iraq War, George W. Bush, I was so disgusted with the US that I wanted to move to Canada. I was also very, very, I haven't really revisited all of those old opinions to see if they still hold up. I think that they still do, but as someone who was very much on the left I was disgusted with our government and what I perceived as a lot of corruption from the right wing.
Mm.
And I actually looked into what it would take to move to Canada. I saw Canada as this beacon of sanity up in the north. And
With
watching
common sense,
Trudeau,
kind of.
yeah, common sense. And okay, so and then Trudeau, for me, and this is going to sound really superficial, but during the early Trump years, I really did not like Trump. I don't believe I ever had the full Trump derangement syndrome. I didn't feel the need to go and march and scream in the streets, but I really did not like him. I was unhappy with this, and I felt like he was a joke, and that it it made our country look like a joke internationally to have this guy at, in the presidency. Well, look what we have now, and that's even more so maybe. But Trudeau, by contrast, seemed so reasonable, intelligent, well-spoken, and very handsome. And so that's where the superficiality comes in. It was all about the optics. And at the time I didn't think it was, but now that I look back, I think that I was being tricked, I was being fooled. But
Yeah.
even if you contrast the way that he sounded at that time to how he sounded through COVID, and the way that he talked about the truckers, and then this way that he's talking about these parents, the guy is irrational.
Deranged.
It's
Yeah.
yes, deranged. And it
Have you
seems like
noticed
I
how
feel
much
embarrassed for him.
he's losing his mind, like almost visibly on a daily basis?
Really?
Mhm.
Yeah.
He's
Yeah.
incoherent.
That's kind of a relief because to see somebody just act that way and so contradictory and get away with it, you're like, it's not right that somebody can get away with it. But then you
Mhm.
watch them break down like psychologically. Okay, we are moral animals. And when we violate our morality, when we violate just like the hard-coded morality in us, then things start going awry. So it takes a phenomenal amount of psychopathy or some sort of like complete disconnection from, or like an amorality on a very deep level to get away with being two-faced, and corrupting your charms to serve whatever power he's serving. Who know
I've wondered
who
about
he's
that
serving.
with these guys like Trudeau and with the governor of Washington State, Inslee, and you see them and you know that they are, because you know their prior speaking history and the way that they have presented in the past. And so they've been reasonable enough people, intelligent enough people, and you see them just absolutely defying logic. And you wonder, what is it that prompts them to do this? What is the payoff for them to
I
sell
don't
out
know. I
so
imagine,
completely?
yeah, I imagine some kind of cushy job afterwards or something. Why else would you go through it? I mean, the guy can't walk around in public without being heckled,
Mhm.
Oh,
like
good,
everywhere he goes.
Yeah.
This
good.
man is hated, and he
Yeah,
and he
he's a
refuses to
vile.
leave.
He's done vile things, and he refuses to be accountable for the
Mhm.
vile things that he's said
Oh
and
my
done.
God. It's so funny because I'm so the funny thing is I talk a lot about Marxism and that because of the research I do in school. And so I've had to kind of develop a sort of understanding of politics, but I'm not actually political at all. I'm just against this stuff in schools. But I just I cannot believe this particular government. It every day right now they just like, okay, so I don't care about the Conservative Party particularly, but he seems to be attacking the Conservative Party leader on a daily basis, accusing him of being aligned with Alex Jones, like constantly. And now they've come out with this Diagolon thing. The Diagolon is kind of like a meme group, right? So they're constantly using these like right-wing boogeymen. I think one of the ministers yesterday was speaking, liberal ministers was speaking that we have to crack down on this right-wing, this right-wing extremism, whilst they started encampments like with the Revolutionary Communist Party at Toronto, the University of Toronto, the University of Victoria, McGill University, unquestionable far left extremism that wished to destroy the system upon which this country is developed. And yet a liberal minister is still willing to go out in public and straight-faced talk about right-wing extremism and Diagolon and all of these things that are kind of, I mean, I'm sure there's right-wing extremists in this country, but it's not, I don't think that's actually the real problem. So
Hmm.
I really don't understand Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen. Apparently, according to our polls, though, that they're not going to be here. But the thing that worries me actually is that although the polls seem to be favoring this conservative party, that they also, I might be speaking out my butt here, but I think they're also sort of favoring the NDP as well, which is our um, basically our communist party. So
Yeah.
don't know how
Mm.
that's going to work out, but we'll
Yeah.
see.
Yeah. So it's interesting. Once you tug on one thing, it inevitably leads to you tugging apart other things. So the gender thing was your vector. Leslie's was counseling, but then once you start getting into these conversations, you're like, wait,
Like a domino.
wait, wait, what? What? So just how radical are you,
So
Melanie?
how radical am I? Do you know, I question that all the time. So I'll give you a little backstory. The woke industry that I was in was environmental science. So I have a lot of education in ecology and environmental science. And this is not my first time around a rodeo of crazy. So I was at the University of East Anglia in 2009 while I was doing my undergraduate. And that is the university that had Climate Gate. Now I was studying environmental science, so the climate research unit, Phil Jones, who was accused of all kinds of things.
Did somebody break into the environment and steal some environmental documents?
Yes. So there was a hack. This was, I think it was before the Copenhagen COP meeting, like days before. And the climate research unit at my university was very involved in creating some of these RCP projections that we use now. And then Phil Jones, who was leading the climate research unit in my department, had their emails hacked, all these kinds of emails. And they were talking about this trick, this statistical trick. And people thought, there was a big controversy around whether or not that they had faked some of this data. There was a public inquiry. It lasted many years. Turns out they were exonerated from any of the accusations. But by the by, whatever you think about that. So I was really kind of in that at the time as well.
Good. This is really interesting. So I want to slow you down, just so I understand what it is, because I haven't really covered this aspect of it. And Leslie, I don't know on your channel to what degree you accept just unspecified abbreviations or acronyms. I don't. So what is an RCP and how is it being used? These are basically the plans that allow the government to control industry, right?
Oh, I can't remember what
Is that what
R
you
is, but
said?
they're
RCP?
like climate projections.
Okay. And so what you're saying is that these models are created by very smart guys, but there's some black box kind of tricky magic stats stuff going on.
Yeah. So I'm not into the sort of details of that specifically, but the climate model. So in the IPCC, you'll have different projections, right? So these are, I think 8.5, 6.5. I can't remember the exact numbers of the projections, but they give different scenarios of climate change, right? So you put all this information into a model, right? So you put all this environmental information into a model, and then it gives you different scenarios for the future, right? High, medium, low is generally the scenarios that you'll see in the IPCC, and most of our global policies have been based on the IPCC stuff, as far as I'm aware.
And how
So
long have these come back, if you know
pardon?
how long have they been making these models and how accurate are they when
Well,
you
that's just
actually
the question, right? So that's the
yeah.
question. That was the whole point of the hack, because people were questioning it then. And I was on side of people saying, you're just a denier, you're just a denier, you're just a denier, even though in my department, we would discuss how unreliable a lot of this information was. This was 2008, 2009. We would discuss the ethics of that and how unreliable it was and what could we, get from sort of this information. So then there was a hack. A lot of this information came out. There was some unfortunate phrasing. But then again, at the time, I was like, no, that's not true. They're just deniers. They're just deniers. But actually, looking back, whether or not the using the statistical trick means that they did fraud is irrelevant. The point is that even then we knew that these projections, we're not entirely sure how reliable they can be, right? So down the line, I doubt at the University of East Anglia, I doubt whether they have those conversations around data reliability now, because you would want to avoid anyone having any kind of, it's just become really, really environmental, ideological in environmental stuff. So at least I had the opportunity to have a much more empirical science education So I suspect that nowadays it would be more ideological than when I did my education. But
What's a denier?
a climate change denier.
How do you deny that climate changes? Isn't climate defined by change?
Okay, so this is another thing, another ethical conversation we had. So we had a lot of ethical conversations in my undergraduate degree and postgraduate. So science communication was a big deal at that time. How do we communicate? Well, two things. Multidisciplinary research was one thing that I question now. And the other one was science communication. So I think YouTube was very, very new at the time, and they would really encourage us to be advocates. We didn't call them activists at the time. We called them advocates. And so they really encouraged us to start YouTube channels and start talking about all these things, because there's these forces, these right-wing forces who are denying that climate change is real. And so we really need to counter that. So this is a really big point of discussion. And
Wow.
Even though I was a mature student and my son was very little at the time, I think he was 3 years old. I was in on that. Like, I never made a channel, but I did attempt to blog. I did
Well, you have
blogs
now.
for a different cause. Yes.
Yeah.
But I'm just saying that those echo chambers existed at the time, right? So I feel like personally, I understand why some people might behave the way that they do and deny all these things, even though it's like calling someone a denier while you're not even investigating your own ideas. But you don't see that when you're in that bubble. But I think this kind of thinking is still very, very predominant in people who consider themselves righteous and moral. Because I tell you what, that's the reason why. Because you want to save the world, right? You want to do the right thing. You want to save the world. And all these people that are denying this, they don't want to save the world, and they're evil, and they just want to consume, and they just want to think of themselves. And so you're not considering other points of view on that. Anyway, my feelings on climate change now, I don't know how I feel about it. I've left STEM, and I've left, academia. I left all that stuff now because I don't know how I feel about all of that. But I do feel like I understand, because of that experience, I feel like I can understand why people going through university can buy a really righteous message where you can save the world. If you just participate in this movement, you can save the world. And not only are you saving the world, but you are a good person. Like, I can really empathize with that. They're wrong. And we have to fight against it, but I understand why they're doing it.
Are they good?
I'm really glad that you're bringing up this climate change piece, because it's something that I've wanted to understand better. Not climate science per se, but the ideology around it. And it's kind of stunning to hear that they were telling you to be advocates in that science-based program, that you were supposed to be, that you were being trained to be a bit of a propaganda arm.
Oh, absolutely. I didn't see it that way, but yes, 100%. Yeah.
It's really interesting. And something that I keep coming back to this, but it seems so insidious, is that when I was in undergrad, which would have been in the mid 2000s, they talked so much in sociology about anomy or anomy, this concept of useless meaninglessness that young people are going to be experiencing as we became more and more automated, and as things became more centralized, and people were just looking for meaning in their lives. They weren't going to find as much meaning through work, and it was this crisis that we were supposed to be gearing up to experience in young people. And so how insidious that you take this knowledge that we're going to have this crisis of meaninglessness, and then you supply people with this meaning. Hey, be an advocate, be an activist. You can change things. You are important because you're supposed to go and beat the drum.
Yeah. Well, listen, I don't trust peer review anymore. And I'll tell you why. Because I ended my STEM career in climate change, but I'm actually an ecologist. So like a wildlife biologist, right? So the natural study, the study of natural systems. And well, why did I end up doing, why did I end up writing a climate change adaptation policy? Well, because that's where the jobs are. Because if you want to have a career, you work in climate change. And so everything has become about climate change. But that's not why I have issues with peer review. I have issues with peer review because even in 2008, 2009, 2010, even then, again in ethics, talking at university about the publications only kind of publishing certain things and there being a bias in the data. So we already knew that then. Now you can't even talk about that because you'll be called all kinds of things. At least then we were able to talk about it, but we were aware that there was bias towards certain types of things. And we know now, I used to laugh at people who said that there was corruption or some kind of conspiracy, like how can you make all these people work together? But I don't think it's like people rubbing their hands and deciding to kind of, you know, only push one narrative. I think it's a lot of cogs in this machine, and certainly with publication, they're not going to publish that you didn't find a difference with warming, right? That they're not going to do that. And so it became very fashionable over the years to publish anything that said that climate change is having an impact on this, that, whatever. And it could be very well true that, you know, the warming of the climate is actually having an impact on this particular species or that particular environment. That could be true. But the problem is that there's a skew in the information, and anybody trying to say, well, actually, I found different information was vilified then, but it's infinitely worse now, because now we have climate justice, this interdisciplinary stuff I was talking to you about. Because at least when I was doing my education, we were like, we don't really want the social sciences and STEM. Could we just not, please? But that is kind of overtaken. So now you have all these people who don't really understand science talking about climate change as though they fully understand what they clearly do not.
You're not talking about Greta Thunberg, I hope, because she's an expert.
Climate justice, that's what I'm saying. Like, that's just become another social justice movement. I mean, I remember telling family member when I was like, oh, this climate change stuff, I think it might be a hoax. You should have seen their face. This is why I'm a right-wing extremist. It's, look, the truth is that I don't think at this point, I'm not sure that we fully understand what's going on because of a lot of factors. So for us to declare positively that these things are actually happening in this particular way, and if we don't do something about it like this, then you're all horrible people and you need to be put in a gulag. Like, that doesn't make any sense to me anymore. I wish we did have the ability to actually do science, because let's not forget, science means that this idea of the scientific consensus doesn't make any sense. I bought into this for a really long time, and I used to call people climate change deniers, but science is supposed to be, look, if we're seeing something that is different to what the expectation is, that should raise a little curiosity bell. We should investigate that more. But what's happened with climate change is that, oh, there's something that's not following this pattern, shut it down, right? So that's why I just don't think we really understand the situation. So I don't think anyone can really say either way what the hell is going on.
What's the likelihood that those who were that didn't jump out or didn't get pushed out or wakened up out of this kind of progression from climate change investigators to climate justice producers, to what degree do the people who are calling other people deniers of climate change going to actively start changing the environment to save the world?
Well, that's the concern. So
and
you're
are they
talking about
doing it now?
adaptation.
And are chemtrails real? Like, how radical are you, Melanie? Are chemtrails real?
Chemtrails are definitely real.
That's such a funny question, because, again, taking you back to my undergraduate degree, in my atmospheric chemistry course, we had a whole few weeks talking about geoengineering, and one of the topics that we learned was the chemical process of cloud seeding as a means to mitigate warming. And we also, again, discussed the ethics of this, amongst other geoengineering ideas. So I can't tell you whether chemtrails are real or not, but I find it curious that, like climate change, people are so quick to say that this is stupid and they're all like crazy conspiracy theorists, because I literally learned about it at university. So I don't understand why this is so controversial. The technology exists. It's not that we know how to do it, but I don't know. I can't possibly say whether they're being done or not.
I think they were actually doing that in Dubai, but they over-calculated and flooded themselves out or something.
It's possible.
A few weeks ago, yeah.
I try not to involve myself in this stuff anymore. Honestly, like you were talking about, I think, Benjamin, you were talking about the dominoes kind of falling. Like you wake up to one little thing, and then everything just falls apart. And that definitely happened to me. And the last domino to fall was the fact that I spent my entire, it's not even career, like life, like even as a teenager, I wanted to do this. So I felt like I spent my entire life propagating things that aren't necessarily true. So I don't know how I haven't investigated that as much because I'm still sort of like, oh, I'm going to just close the box. I don't think I can handle that just yet.
Okay,
Um,
because I was gonna ask. This is really interesting that you're taking it. You kind of answered my question before I asked it, in a very novel fashion. Because I was thinking, you lose, you start to wake up to these different things and these different issues, but then you realize that these issues are being propagated by institutions, and
yeah.
some people like have faith in the institution, have faith
Yep.
in the science, and to lose that, to watch that all collapse can send one into despair. But you brought up really something interesting. You're like, wait, I'm culpable in this. Like
Yeah.
I
Well,
have
I am.
responsibility
Yes.
for this. So it's not just the
Well,
institution. It's like, oh, I'm a factor, or at least I was a factor
well,
to
one thing
one
that
degree or
makes me
another.
not I guess, a progressive leftist is I've always believed in personal responsibility. I've never been a very good in that way. Like I believe in individualism, and I believe in taking personal responsibility for things. This is why I thought the problems with my son when he went to school wasn't it's the school, it's me. And I spent years thinking it was me. Turns out a lot of it is the school. But so I think we need to take responsibility for those things. But that doesn't mean, I think when you come to the realization that maybe you've done something that isn't great, then if you continue doing it out of fear or out of whatever, then I might think, not great. But my response to that is like, I can't do that anymore. I have to do something different with my life.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's a bit jarring though. I mean, still to this day, you asked me if I was radical. Like my friends will tell you this at the minute. Well, close friends, I'm constantly questioning my sanity because I did spend my entire life believing things that now I understand are not true. And I don't fully understand what is true. I am advocating for a better understanding of schools and what's going on in school. And I try my very best to always read the literature, always try to interpret it correctly. I'm always questioning whether what I'm reading is correct. Yeah, I'm always questioning what's real and what isn't real because I want to
So
avoid going back into, or one, becoming radical in any direction, and two, starting to believe things and propagating things that aren't true.
yeah. How do you, where do you find your stability and your sanity then? Like what's something you can't question or you don't have to question because you just
I don't know where I
accept?
find. I don't know. I
Yeah.
have no idea. I don't know. I sometimes I have to take a few days off where I refuse to speak to anyone. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know.
Something that's been interesting in this whole conversation around gender, there's a gender critical conversation started up, and you talked about meeting all these people in Canada and forming this network, and it's been a similar thing online, like all of these people finding each other and forming this sort of loose web of communication and sharing and getting to know these personalities and stuff. And so um, one thing I did watch an episode that you and Shannon did about the purity spiraling that's happened in here. And I know that's kind of a non sequitur, we're just jumping, but what was that like for you to find yourself in the middle of a different swirl of social conflict within the gender critical community?
Yeah, so I'll give a bit of context. You're talking about a list that was put out by Kelly J. Keane denouncing some people over having conversations with Julia Malott, who's a trans woman. Most of the people on that list, not all, but most of the people on that list were part of my network here in Ontario. And these are parents, these are individuals that are just regular citizens. These are people who actively go to their boards, who try to talk to the school boards, try to talk to the teachers, who are actively engaged in their communities trying to make a difference. I took exception to this list because all they did was have a conversation in good faith with Julia. Now, Kelly J. Keane had a problem with Julia being trans, and we know how they feel about trans people. And then Shannon and I had used our, I guess, used our platform to talk about free speech, and that it was really important. Look, at the end of the day, we don't have to agree with anyone. It's really important to be able to speak, to debate. And we're never going to be able to do that if you start bullying people who disagree with you. Well, I wasn't surprised by the reaction to that, because actually, when I started speaking, I was expecting, I was expecting this meme idea of these trans people attacking you. I never to this day have received that, ever. I have only ever received that kind of treatment from, well, the TERFs, frankly, and not just any TERFs, but these sort of ultra TERFs who wish to
GC Ultras.
Yes. So I will speak out against that. I have no problem speaking against that, because look, we all, I don't know. I just don't understand. I don't know. Anyway, we'll see. I'm glad. I'm glad that they have made the issue public, and I agree on principle with what they're trying to do. I agree that men should not be in female prisons. You know, we should probably not have allow men in the female change rooms and toilets. We've seen all kinds of incidents. So on principle, I agree with what they're trying to do, but I don't agree with this small group of women who feel the need to just go after anyone who's actually has a slightly different opinion than you do. That I don't understand. But you were part of that too. I think you were on the list.
Yeah, I was on the list. It was frustrating, but interesting to observe, you know, just how, what, maybe 10% difference in opinion can incite such ire versus something more, you know, farther away from your opinion, which is these are the people you're trying to convince.
Yep.
We're trying to convince you to join our side, but if you join our side and understand things the way we do, and you don't understand them exactly the way we do, then we're going to light you on fire.
Oh yeah, that video still to this day will receive comments. That was weeks and weeks, maybe
the one
even a
you
couple
did
months ago. Yeah,
Oh.
it still gets comments, and all the comments are predictable. You know.
Yeah, they're running a script. It's funny,
but they're watching my video,
tiring.
so that's fine.
Yeah,
I
they're
mean,
watching
like,
your
look,
video. You're getting engagement, so you're coming out ahead.
yeah. Thank you, TERFs. Thank you
Yeah,
for watching
let's
my
pour
video
one
and
out for
getting
the
angry.
TERFs.
What do you pour out for a TERF?
I don't know, some sort of gender fluid, I'm sure.
Lovely. Yeah, well,
So-
it's interesting to be in the middle of both sides of things. So it's, I guess, a way to check yourself and check where you are with relation to.
Well, for the longest time, I didn't really want to talk about adults anyway. I still don't know exactly. I don't know if I want to get involved in that, because look, adults is a very different situation. But, you know, when it comes to children, it's pretty cut and dry. At the end of the day, this is not a good idea, right?
Well,
they have no idea what they're
cut and
doing.
wet too if it doesn't heal right, but
Precisely.
Yeah.
Like, it's pretty straightforward moral issue. And so here in Canada, I think it was, I can't remember his name. One of the MPs came out and was like, there's no such thing as parental rights, when Alberta decided to put some changes in the law there. And frankly, he's correct. There is no such thing as parental rights in Canada. But it's very helpful for an MP like that to come out and speak like that, because normal people hear this and go, what? What do you... What? And so, at least, okay, so I'm also part of another group called the Parents' Rights Coalition of Canada, and it's like a coalition. We had a summit in January. We're about to have another summit on May 25th, and it brings together different speakers or experts in Canada to try to help parents in our parents' rights movement, right? And so those kinds of MP kind of help our message, because we're trying to get across to regular citizens that, in particular schools, they don't respect you, and they don't respect you, or even our politicians support that lack of respect. You know, the school policies are telling you in them that they don't respect you. So yeah, that's kind of helpful.
Well, you said you don't want to get into the conversation about adults, and something I've been thinking about with regard to that, we hear there's a lot of talk right now about safeguarding children and protecting children from obviously predatory practices and unethical things that violate the principle of consent, informed consent. also a conversation that a topic that I am very interested in right now is pornography. And this is
Yeah.
another area where you hear, let's put age limits and age restrictions on these things. But I think that at the end of the day, we do have to start talking about adults at some point, because
Yeah.
if your society has no sense of ethics or virtue, what are you actually raising kids to be? Is it
Yeah.
just like you're 18, so here the floodgates open and there's all unlimited debauchery and body modification and all kinds of things it's just the menu is wide open, pick whatever you'd like.
Yeah.
And I think that in order to know how we want to raise our children, we have to have some sort of anchor in virtue,
Yeah.
or some sense of what our virtues are or
Yeah.
values. I don't know. What do you
No,
think
I
about that?
agree. I agree with you. I agree with you. I think there is. So I think, okay, so the problem for me is this idea of queer, right? This having no limiting principles on principle, as they say. And this is I think this is kind of the problem that you're talking about. This is my understanding of it anyway, right? So this excuse to kind of have this ultra, it's not even libertarian, it's more like libertine lifestyle where anything goes, and we've forgotten kind of so we used to know, we used to understand okay, so you're in counseling, you understand psychology. I don't, this is not my area, but as far as I'm aware, we used to understand that children developed in a certain way where if you introduce them to sexual content before they're ready, or sexual ideas before they're ready, that actually has a harmful effect. We used to understand that, and all of a sudden with this concept of queering, we don't understand that anymore. And it's not even just for children, like you say, it's also adults. So if adults are then doing that, we used to understand that that is not ideal for children, so maybe we don't, and we're not doing that anymore. So yeah, no, that is that is an issue. I just don't know how to, at least here in Canada, it almost seems like the only way to even have that conversation properly is to be able to address the issue with children first.
Oh, and yeah, once you deal with that, you're gonna have to deal with that maids thing that you guys got going on over there. Isn't that
Maids,
great?
medical
Yeah, made
assistants in dying.
made in made in Canada.
I
Isn't that
used to be
great?
totally for this idea of ethical euthanasia until I seen what it actually looks like. Canada has a way of taking these European ideas that in some respects were kind of well done for what they were in Europe, and then Canada just makes it really bad, like decriminalizing drugs. It worked pretty well in Portugal. Canada does it. And well, I know I think Benjamin, you had a conversation with one of my, somebody in my network recently
Your
about
friends, yeah.
about this particular topic. Yeah, so I don't know what's up with Canada in that way, but yeah, let's
Hmm.
let's not made, shall we?
Is there a human institution that you still have some lingering respect for?
A lingering human institution?
Lingering respect for
Uh,
a human institution, because schools are failing you, the medical industry, it seems like, is failing you. Science, well, at least science. What's the opposite of deny?
I
Science
don't. I
acceptance.
Yeah, I don't know that I do have faith in institutions. I have faith in people.
Okay.
I mean, even just now we were talking about, Leslie, you were talking about how individuals have kind of grouped together and formed these networks and speaking out and finding each other, right? Those are individuals. And I think through those individuals we can rebuild things. But certainly here in Canada, the institutions have failed us almost on every single level. And it's up to, I've kind of realized that it's really up to us individuals to do something about it, right? But to do that, we have to be able to create an environment where we can disagree. So this is why I don't see the point of attacking people like the Kelly J. Keens of the world, attacking people who disagree. We need to be able to rebuild by having disagreements, right? So I don't think that I trust many institutions, as it were, because I think they've been pretty corrupted at this point.
Seems like part of the lifespan of an institution to end up being more self-serving than aimed towards its original purpose.
I don't know. Maybe. I think here some of the issue is that everything becomes really centralized.
Mhm.
And I think that's also true in the UK. Because I mean, look, the UK is also having issues with that sort of problem. They're just slightly different issues, right? And so they probably have a lot more problems with a bubbling Marxism and bubbling communism issues kind of popping up there than here in Canada. That's a big problem here too. You guys are really lucky in the US. You seem to have again, as a Brit and Canadian, you sort of have this for a lot, and I'm sorry to say, but a lot of them have this almost like a complex about Americans, right? So they're like, Americans are so stupid, they're so fat, they don't know what they're talking about, blah, blah. It's putting down Americans really fashionable. And so I grew up in that environment, especially my French Canadian family, and it's especially common to hate on Americans in the French Canadian community. But I've grown to really, really respect and admire Americans. And let me tell you why. Because throughout all of this woke stuff, it's the strongest voices against these things or trying to push back on it have been Americans. And so I feel like not only do you have a constitution that can help protect you against some of these horrors if you manage to protect your constitution, but those films from the 80s and 90s, whatever, America would save the world, which we used to think, oh, look, it's another American movie where they save the world, but you guys might actually save the world because of your constitution. So I've come to really, really respect that. I never thought I would be a fan of American Republicans, but you know what? If it wasn't for you guys, I think we'd all be living under communist rule right now. I think it's like that last bastion of keeping things sane.
Isn't that funny? A little reversal.
Well, I look at those Americans saving the world movies very different now.
What, Team America, World Police? Coming to save the motherfucking day, yeah. You remember that one? You don't remember that one?
No, I
America,
don't.
fuck yeah.
Is it like South Park or something?
Yeah.
Oh, okay,
the
then
same
I do
guys,
remember it. Yeah, yeah, I
South
do.
Yeah.
Park. But that was in the peak 2000s when Bush was in office, and it was cool. I mean, I lived in Portland. I was in the enclave. It was really cool to hate on or to mock, to look down on that. I kind of did that a little bit, but I was kind of kept all the politics at arm's distance until it like came for me, I'm like, okay, fine, let's do this. And now I'm a freaking monarchist. I want complete tyrannical control over everything till it gets sorted out. I just need it. I want the reset. I just want the reset. Just a nice clean.
What does that mean?
Just a really strong reorganization of the United States federal government, to make all the unaccountable bureaucrats accountable finally, by having a very strong leader come in and dismantle it and then rebuild it in a very
It's such an idealistic perspective, though,
Everything's
because
idealistic, Leslie.
monarchist,
It's an idea.
I know.
She's a monarchist. You're a monarchist. I mean, you guys have a really
something
ditzy
drastic needs to
monarchy.
change, though, period.
Yeah.
At some point.
Something has to-
I mean,
something
regardless
has
of what
to
that
happen.
is.
I don't trust the oligarchy right now, and democratic power is only good for getting that tyrant into power. So,
You see,
Caesar.
you just hit the nail on the head there. So I like you, I never occupied myself with politics when I was younger, even though I was in the environment stuff. But politics as such, I didn't really look into. But I've become more interested in political ideology because of what I read through the schools. So the critical pedagogy, the critical race theory, the critical queer pedagogy. So all of this stuff made me have to learn about some of these ideas. And then I had to learn about what individualism really is and sort of all of these things, right? And we have a real problem in North America, at least, with what I see as this very strong undercurrent of communism and communist sympathetic ideas. And I actually do think it's a bit of a problem. And most people don't try to understand what they really think about things and kind of let things happen. And somehow, but the thing is, right, it's easy for us to be like, oh, they're just stupid. Communism killed a lot of people, blah, blah, blah. But the fact is that, like you say, oligarchy, right? So over the last few decades, young people have facing difficulty, right? So they certainly here in Canada, there's no way they can buy a house, right? They struggle to buy food. And so nobody's offering a better solution. And all you have is people telling you if you destroy the system, then you're going to live in utopia. And where's anyone else trying to sell them like a better future, right? So yeah, I see that as maybe a bit of a bubbling problem that could become bigger over time. I hope not. That's my black pill. That is one of my black pill moments. Having to read this stuff and watch it happen and think, oh, that's going to bubble over.
Yeah. It's kind of funny during this current crop of protest season antics on college campuses. There's like administrators and people, like you see them every once in a while, every couple of days, they're like, "Who's radicalizing all our students?" And you're
Oh,
like,
that was a policeman,
"You
wasn't it?
did that." I mean, it was a policeman, but it was a few days ago. Like who, somebody was arrested on college campus, and they're like, but you accepted me because of all my activist stuff, like that's why I'm here, because you saw that I was an activist. What did
Oh,
you
I didn't see
expect?
that.
Same
I
with
saw the
Evergreen,
policeman.
like, we're gonna teach you to overthrow the system, and then they're like, okay, let's overthrow the system. We're like, no, not us, not us,
Not this
no,
system. We meant that
no,
system.
let me go to the bathroom.
Yeah. I don't know. Well, yeah, obviously you covered Evergreen. You were at Evergreen.
Yeah,
Uh,
we're gonna
and it
do a
does,
watch. Me and Layla are gonna do a live reaction watch. She hasn't watched the
I
craziness.
feel like
No,
it's very evergreeny what's happening.
yeah,
Just
Evergreen's
just throw
evergreen.
like the sort of Muslim/Islam element on top of it, but it feels very evergreeny,
Yeah,
what I've been noticing.
yeah, it's pretty ridiculous.
Do you have any
But
predictions?
yeah,
Actually, out of curiosity, do you have any predictions based on covering Evergreen and covering these topics over the years? Do you have any predictions on how it might peter out if it worked?
this is really interesting. It's gonna peter out because the kids they don't really have staying power. They're just expressing a lot of pent up energy from the winter and the spring, and then they're all gonna go off to their summer jobs or whatever. And I don't see it continuing to go and spill out like in the summer of love slash Floyd bonanza of just internecine violence for months on end until suddenly it just all of a sudden police violence just vanishes once Biden gets into power. Like, wow, Biden's so good. It's just like the whole concern about thousands of black people being shot every year just like vanishes from the public imagination. You got to wonder about that. But the interesting thing about the Israel Palestine as a topic for this current revolutionary spark is that I don't see how the oligarchs or the bureaucrats or like the managerial elite folds this into encroaching more into greater power. With George Floyd, they got to implement all their DEI, staff all of HR, and totally front load like just put that stuff right front and center and make it explicitly ideological to get into these institutions and to be a part of the institutions that you have to believe in this CRT DEI stuff, right? I don't see how this stuff's going to work with the especially because like Israel is like there's a lot of left Jews, so like you have this ethnic problem here, which is not the same as like Black Americans being used as as the bait to switch and to encourage more. So I think inevitably this stuff turns into more state power or more bureaucratic power, and it'll be interesting to see how this Palestinian slash Israel stuff turns into more state power, because it's just like it doesn't quite work with the whole. It does work with the oppressor oppressed dynamics, but the bureaucratic system, I don't see how they make that
No, me
more.
neither. Me neither. So during the Million Marches for Children, so I was involved in helping organize those, amongst many, many other people, but I was involved in that. And there was a very strong Muslim presence. Obviously, they don't want their kids to be taught that they're born in the wrong body, et cetera, right? So there
Yeah.
was many, many Muslims. But as soon as October 7th rolled around, I mean, that completely fractured everything. So people who had
No.
previously been working together got blocked and all kinds of things on all kinds of different lines. So it kind of reorganized all of these groups. And so now
Yeah.
you have the Queers for Palestine, which is even here in the University of Toronto, there's a liberated zone for the she's, theys, and gays kind of signs, right? So
The Shias, gays, and theys.
well, what I want to know is what Pride Month is going to look like. I really want to know because the
Oh, yeah.
fracturing with the Million Marches, I just really want to know what that's going to look like. I'm actually genuinely, maybe this is I don't know how this is going to come
Schadenfreude.
across, but yeah, I am. I'm looking forward to
Yeah.
seeing what that's going to kind of look like. Because look, at the University of Toronto started, I think it was not last night overnight, but overnight at 4 a.m. this encampment at the university, and they were handed a note from the administration saying you need to clear out by 10 o'clock. Well, obviously they didn't clear out by 10 o'clock. Our union, was it CUPE union? Huge. So unions are huge in Canada. CUPE union is some of the unions that protested against us parents, called us fascists and bigots and so on. We're there with the Palestinians now. It's headed by somebody called Fred Hahn. Now, Fred Hahn is a very effeminate sort of gay man, and he's very much queers for Palestine, you know, he's really into the trans kids stuff, and he's there with students now. Most of them at the schools or at the university campuses are probably more that inclined. So other protests have been very heavily sort of Muslim led, but these university ones are, I guess, more the more well-off young kids. But by the by, the unions have still been with the Palestine protests. But what is that going to look like, right? What is that going to look like come June? Are they still going to be standing together? I don't know. Maybe they really need to use each other for the revolution. Maybe that's enough. Maybe it's not.
Yeah, yeah. Who gets the last coloscopy from that power dynamic?
Well, the fracturing seems like it would be, it's easy to hypothesize that that's the whole point. There was this cartoon that I saw a long time ago that I really liked. It's like a Machiavelli sort of thing, with the prince is looking over the castle wall, and there's all these protesters out there. There's this mob, the angry mob, and the advisor is saying, you don't have to fight the torch people and the pitchfork people. You just have to convince the pitchfork people that the torch people want their pitchforks.
Yeah, well, I think that's what our government is supporting. I think that's why they allow all this stuff to happen.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, look, our prime minister, after the million marches, was very keen and quick to denounce these horrific bigoted parents, right? And yet this stuff has been going on, well, as you know, since October 7th, right? Well, a bit of a peep. There's been some peeps, but it's very sort of contained peeps, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know about where you are, but here in Toronto, I mean, these protests have been daily, or at least every weekend. There's always something going on. If you're driving around Toronto, you'll see Palestine flags being flown over the roads and stuff, right? So, yeah, I don't know. And
like
are
a
they
hockey
actually going to
game.
clear these encampments? I don't know.
Yeah.
Seems pretty wild though over in the Pacific Northwest.
Is it? I don't know. I'm such a shut in.
Mm,
We go for walks every once in a while. We live in a pretty sleepy town, albeit a
yeah.
prison town.
All I've seen online with some of the university kids kind of, well, it's to be expected, I guess.
Yeah, I've heard
Yeah.
UW is pretty bad.
The Antifa
Yeah,
types.
they put up some very unimaginative graffiti at Evergreen.
Like what?
Now, currently?
Yeah, I got it a couple days ago from a professor that I'm still in contact with there. I just really like genocide or whatever, just really stupid stuff. Here, let me see if I can find it.
But you seem pretty
hold on a
certain it'll peter out. But the thing is, once this kinds of stuff does tame, and it will eventually, none of these ideas have gone away. Like they're still there. They're still bubbling. They're still,
second.
you know, it's just a
Well,
matter of time.
so when I press James Lindsay, my friend, he's a smart guy. He's a motor mouth. I get to speak with him every couple months. And I ask him what's the end game for this, or what's the perfect counter for this. And in my studies of that shady far right zone on the internet, I'm like, there's some good ideas here. There's some bad ideas. Might be some overreaction the other way. The pendulum might swing, but I don't know if it'll swing. But it does have to. The question is, do we have as individuals the political will to say stop, to tell this system to stop? Do we have the
Okay.
political will to plug ourselves into these school boards, into these local councils, and say stop? And that is the question. But I think that there is a natural in my generation, Gen X. I think we were a little, and this could just be me, but we were a little. This is the mood that I picture of us having is like, okay, it'll just run itself. And the boomers are always looking down on us, and we're never really respected by the boomers, so we kind of just skated through, like, well, okay, well, whatever. Like we were kind of apathetic. And then the millennials wanting something and lacking that magic element of irony that Gen X allowed us to kind of skate. They wanted to believe in something. We skipped a generation, and that's what you see why everything happened in 2014 or 2010 in universities is that old guard, that boomer guard, kind of it tipped over, and they all hired people that were more radical than them, and it just tipped over into this millennial kind of Gen X millennial, um, kind of highly leftist, highly activist, highly cringy believers in this postmodern idealistic utopianism. They all got in power, and then Trump happens, and then they just like they just lose whatever brain cells were actually functioning, um, and then they kind of skitsed out. But there's something about that. There's something about the will to resist the bureaucratic system and how these individual issues are necessary to fight on these various fronts: schools, gender stuff with trans kids stuff, and immigration, which Canada's got some issues with too,
Yes.
but different issues because your government is the one that is just, well, no, our government is intentionally destroying our economy too. But you guys are kind of, there's a kind of different system to how that's happening.
Yeah. So you talked, I want to talk about the far right for a minute.
Oh,
So maybe we
how
can end
far?
on some of this
Yeah, how
far right
far?
stuff. So
Melanie, how far? That's my question.
we're
How
going to go
far?
far. We're going to go
Okay.
right down into what the far right really means. In Canada, we keep hearing our politicians talking about the far right and how it's this really big threat. And certainly that's the case when we're talking about
It should be a
pedagogy.
threat to them.
When we're talking about pedagogy, especially, it's all over the place. So where is this far right? Because when you're a regular Canadian, you're like, yeah, the far right's terrible. It's Nazis, isn't it? Isn't that like Hitler? Well, no, unfortunately, that is not what is meant by the far right. And in my travels reading the literature, so there's this thing, I'm just going to tell a little story. There's this thing called the Trans Affirming Toolkit, which is a toolkit that has been released for educators in Ontario. It is done by some academics at Western University who are really into this queer pedagogy stuff. And is a toolkit that's meant to provide guidance and resources for educators on how to trans and queer their classrooms. And they received their funding for a multi-year project on the basis of fighting the far right. Let me just read you. Dr. Wayne Martino is the lead principal investigator at Western University. And the title of the project is Supporting Transgender Students and Transgender Affirmative Education in a Context of Resurgent Anti-Trans Backlash and Far-Right Extremism. Well, that was interesting. So when you look at the toolkit, it's obviously intersectional, and you see the anti-oppressive education, and it looks, it's been all over our news, well, at least the right-wing news, saying, isn't this terrible? But I wanted to find out more about what does this mean? And so me being me, I went to the literature, and I've been reading papers from Mr. Martino and his team on what that is. And lucky me, see, the thing is about critical educators, especially of the queer variety, is they really like to tell you exactly what they're doing in the literature. Now, they change that when they make policies and so on and so forth to make it more appealing. But in the literature, I encourage anyone listening, if you want to know what's going on, go read the academic literature. And this particular paper, he writes a lot of papers, but in this particular paper about the toolkit written in 2022, just in case anyone's interested, I'll read you the title of the paper: Supporting Transgender Students in Schools Beyond an Individualist Approach to Trans Inclusion in the Education System. But this paper specifically tells us that the far right, it doesn't say the far right is individualism, but the whole premise of this paper is that individualism in and of itself is the force of oppression that must be addressed by educators, right? So the idea of humanistic individualism or liberal values, it's a case study. They're doing a case study of multiple teachers and trying to critique, as they do, their approaches, their liberal values. So they're critiquing their liberal values, saying, you know, we can't do inclusion. Okay, so inclusion is what we used to do in schools. So that is a liberal value. Okay, we want to move away from that. Why do we want to move away from that? Well, it's oppressive because it expects a child to announce themselves as queer or trans. Well, that's just oppression. We can't do that. We have to have affirmative values. Well, what do affirmative values mean? Well, instead of, okay, let me take it back just a step here. Well, why wouldn't you want to wait for somebody to announce themselves? The reason why that's an oppressive liberal value is because that's cisgenderism. Well, what is cisgenderism? Cisgenderism is the assumption that everybody isn't trans, right? And the assumption that everybody is heterosexual. There's heteronormativity in that as well. So by assuming that everybody is not trans, and by assuming that everybody is heterosexual, and waiting for somebody to announce themselves under individual values, individualist values, liberal values, that's just oppression, because it's cisgenderism, and that's terrible. So what do we want to do instead? Well, we want to have affirmative values. Well, trans affirmation, which is the whole point of this toolkit being pushed all over Ontario right now by our unions and by our schools, is treat the entire classroom, not just the entire classroom, the entire school system, as though it were queer and trans. You have to treat everybody like they're already queer and trans. That eliminates cisgenderism, right? So we've affirmed everybody as queer because in other papers by Lady Girl Hannah Dyer, all children are queer. So we should treat all children like they're queer anyway. And so that's the whole premise of this particular paper. And beyond that, in this paper, they give suggestions as to how you can create affirmative schools. And those schools can become affirmative schools by creating what they call gender democratization. They've coined a new term. At least I think they're the ones who coined the term. So what does gender democratization look like?
It sounds communist to me.
We elevate every gender identity. We explore gender identity. We elevate all gender identities. And there's a line in there that says, we're not trying to abolish the gender binary, but, and then they go and describe how they're going to completely delegitimize the entire male and female, whatever gender binary, by like making all kinds of non-binary and queer and whatever identities perfectly legitimate. This paper is absolutely brilliant to understand exactly what queering schools mean and where the education system in Canada is going. Oh, they also call it gender facilitative schools. So that's the whole point of all this, is to create gender facilitation. And there's another paper which I'm still trying to unpick at the minute.
Gender facilitation. Wow.
Oh yeah. What does that mean? So I think it'll make a bit more sense when I've got my head around this.
I picture like one of those airport taxi guys, but with dildos. He's just like, you.
Well, that's just it, to facilitate more queerness. Now there's another paper that they wrote, which is, I can't remember the title.
They literally are coming for your children.
Wait a second.
Right.
They are. Okay. So this paper is like YouTube as a site of desubjugation for trans identities, blah, 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 blah. Same people, same year. Yeah. And the whole premise of this paper is, well, how do you create gender facilitative environments? Well, they don't say that in that paper, but I'm making this particular link here. But the whole paper is about, there is this YouTube video where this lady asks questions about gender, probably a non-binary individual, and has all these questions about your gender identity. And it was quite popular. There's several thousand response videos exploring people's gender identities. So they use that as saying, this is a case study of, we really, really need to present all this creative gender exploration to kids. We really do, because we need to get them to explore whatever queerness that may be latent within them that they might not be exposed to. And so by exposing people to other people's gender journeys, they can then come to understand their own better. Well, I will posit that is what a gender facilitative school would do, is to allow or to create this situation where children can spend all this time, examining other people's gender and to be able to pick their own. Okay. Now, if you think about this paper is basically saying that being queer and trans is a social contagion. They're just saying it in postmodernist language, but that's what they're saying, that you have to present these things to other people, to kids, so that they can adopt their own gender. Well, what the hell is a social contagion then? So I'm still trying to explore that particular paper. I make videos. I've been trying to make sort of deep dive videos, I guess, exploring the literature, reading through quotes from the papers. So here I'm translating it, but in those videos I will read from the papers to give those examples, because I think parents need to understand that. I am really trying to encourage anyone interested in some of these issues to read the literature, because they're very, very explicit. I think it was Logan Lansing in his last podcast said something that really struck a chord with me, because this has exactly been my experience. They're really proud of this in the literature. They will tell you overtly what it is they're doing in the literature, and it's worse than what we're seeing in policies or in public. That's been massaged. It's been massaged and made more appealing for a progressive liberal audience.
Euphemized.
But in the literature, they'll tell you their plans overtly. They're super proud of it. So I just really want to encourage people to go read those. Anyway,
it's so interesting. It's like, get the kids to obsess about themselves sexually.
Well,
and
facilitate
then they
them,
won't pay attention to anything else that's going on in the world. They'll just be too busy obsessing. The more I hear this, the more I start thinking maybe all of this sexuality stuff, this trans and non-binary, and I'm this kind of sexual, I'm that kind of sexual, maybe it's all autosexuality.
No,
and
I doubt
because well, no, I mean, I'm saying I'm starting to wonder if that's what's at the heart of it, is that it's an obsession about yourself, because it's not relational, it's introspective, it's self-examination, and it's not about relationship the way a sexual orientation is, like homosexuality or heterosexuality.
Well, I'll tell you this from the literature as well. So there's a lot. So Canada seems to have a lot of this. So it's like really kind of spawned a lot of this thinking in pedagogy in particular. And so early childhood education, critical queer pedagogy has a lot of papers.
More pederasty than pedagogy, but
we can argue that for sure. But and most of the people writing this are women, just by the way. But
what's up with that?
Fuck knows. But in some of this stuff over the past 10 years, there's been a lot of writing about how you have to queer the classroom because queer adults exist, right? And I use queer specifically because a lot of this is queer. They include trans in queer, but they're really talking about queer as everything.
Yeah.
And queer, let's be really frank, is an identity without an essence, is what does the child, according to Hannah Dyer. You know, it's a meaningless sort of thing that you can adopt. It is not a sexual orientation. But anyway, so the reason that they have to queer the classroom and queer children and queer childhood, these early childhood education academics, okay, so 5-year-olds, 10-year-olds, doesn't matter, 2-year-olds in preschool, right? The reason you have to do that is because queer adults exist, trans adults exist. And because queer adults exist and trans adults exist, well, that must mean that some of these kids in this classroom, well, they're also queer and they're trans, but they have no way of knowing it because we live in a heteronormative society and we're oppressing that innate, unexplored queerness. And so the only moral thing to do is to bring that out, right? And so that's where you get all these books who are talking about how you're a blue crayon, but you think you're a red crayon and all of these things. And that somehow has kind of got into the minds of educators as this really good thing to do. But that's the reason I bring that up is because that to me is the same argument with AGP, right? So you have these men who believe that they're women, who are fetishizing the idea of women, who want to desperately believe that trans children are a thing because it sort of justifies their own.
Validates them.
Yeah, it's the same stuff.
Yeah. You know, I would really be interested, if you are interested, Melanie, in joining us for one of our Monday live streams sometime and bring one of these documents along and we can put it on the screen and read some of this.
Can we deconstruct the deconstructionists?
Let's deconstruct it. Yeah.
I would love to.
Okay.
Yeah. I've got a few papers that we could look at. I've been on a tirade against particularly this Wayne Martino and his colleague, Kenan Omarakchik, I like to name names
Mhm.
because Kenan was his PhD student. Is he a they, them? I'm not sure. But he was Wayne Martino's PhD student. But now, so they had a release video for the Western University Toolkit thing. They did this video launch. And in there, Kenan, I think, said that he was moving on to work into policy, educational policy at the Ottawa Carleton School Board. So to write a policy like that, right?
Mm.
Me describing what the literature is saying about what their intentions are, and then to go work in school policy. So yeah, I would love to talk about their work much, much, much more given the opportunity.
Great. Well, sounds like they need some light shown on them. What did
Was
we
that a
not
veiled
cover that we
threat for
should
conversion therapy of the
convert
pederasts?
them?
Yeah, like maybe put them in a wood chipper of sanity.
No,
Of
that wasn't
sanity.
it wasn't a euphemism. It's
Okay.
just real. People need to see. I think there's a
Yeah.
lot of that. It's kind of like we talked about with some of the other the idea that you're in a bubble, that you're in this little echo chamber of thought. And I think you know, when you talked about, Melanie, that you'd seen some red flags over the years, that you kind of were you'd kind of see it but ignore it or rationalize around it or whatever. It's easy to think, oh, it can't be that bad.
Yeah.
Oh, they must be exaggerating. And I think the more we talk about it, hopefully it can break through some of these echo chambers. The more people are just willing to have open conversations in a reasonable way. It's not,
Hmm.
you know, just putting out there what's happening.
Yeah.
I
Well, I'll
think
tell you this.
helpful.
I've been to events where, so look, I am interested in literature and I lean that way because of my own academic career history. And so that's where I've leaned. But I'm not an educator. I have never been at teacher college. I've taught postgraduate stuff, but not, you know, like I'm not an educator. But then I followed the literature and it took me into all this stuff. I'm reading all this philosophy. And I've had teachers, more than one, come up to me and say, I didn't know the stuff that you were reading, right? Because I even go into some of the Peter McLaren stuff or Henry Giroux, kind of making those links from the past, because a lot of this does come from OISE here in Toronto. And they've come up to me that I didn't know that. And me thinking, both on the one hand, that's really awesome. I'm really glad that you were able to get something from what I was explaining. But on the other hand, I think, I'm not an educator. Why am I surprising you with this knowledge? Because none of this is hidden. It is all completely accessible. Anyone can type in this information and find it online. Like I'm not doing anything. Like I'm not an investigative journalist. So if it's a question of just people need to watch a YouTube video to glean that information, then maybe that's what we need to do, because yeah, it's all there. This is not mysterious.
I'm glad you're doing this. I'm glad you're taking the time to parse this stuff and explain it to people, show people what it is.
Yeah, well, it only really works if they come across it, if they watch it. I'm doing my best. Yeah, if we could only go. So the thing is, I know a lot of people who delegate at school boards, and increasingly, especially here in Ontario, well, probably across the country, there are changes in rules that are now stopping parents from even being able to delegate. So at first it was reducing the amount of people who are allowed in the room. And then recently, Shannon went to do a delegation in Ottawa, and they're like, oh, well, there's new rules. Now it went from like 10 minutes or something like that down to 2 minutes. Oh, now you have 2 minutes, right? And so there's all these, and then a new rule that has come up recently is, oh, now we have to approve. So now you have to submit what you're delegating about, and then they approve it. And so you know where that's going to go, obviously, because we're just trying to find creative ways to get this information out to people so that they do know what's going on. Because like I thought it would be as simple as, oh, just point to a paper and people would read it, or just throw a link to a paper into some thread somewhere and then people would read it and it'll all blow open. No, I was like, okay, well, if that's the case, then maybe if I read it on a video and explain it to you in a way that's maybe mildly entertaining, then maybe that'll work. And I think that's had a bit more success, right? So
you went from battling deniers to battling deniers over the course of a
yes.
year. public career.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
Melanie, where can people find you? And what are your links?
Pronouns.
And what
What are my pronouns? My
Wait,
pronoun is
your
Finkel
handles.
Dusty. And so
Finkel
I'm
Dusty.
yeah, I tried to put
Jeez,
out
that's
some
messy.
information on, well, okay, so I started off on Twitter in, I think it was April 2023, having like basically never used it. And I was trying to be anonymous at first. So I was like, what? I need to come up with a stupid anonymous name. And it stuck. So I'm at Finkel Dusty. I'll write it down for you guys on Twitter. And we also, with my partner in crime, Shannon Boucher, we run the weekly Canadian Gender Wars report. I think we talked about this early in the episode. We talk about the news and gender in Canada, and I try to do some sort of deep dives into some of this literature stuff here in Canada. That's pretty much it.
Fun. Do you have any plans for the summer months or Pride season, as it's otherwise called in Canada?
I'm just getting my popcorn out. I can't afford holidays anymore. No, it's just me, man.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Maybe like dip my toes in a lake somewhere. No,
Okay,
sadly, it's too
do you have like
expensive in crummy Canada.
a relationship with the outside world that is particularly enjoyable, like gardening or walking
Oh, yeah.
or golfing?
Oh, absolutely. No, I do
All of
actually
the
spend
above.
a lot of time outdoors, funnily
That's
enough.
good.
I won't have the pleasure of a fancy holiday or anything like that.
No.
No, I've had the pleasure of meeting really good friends through all of this, and they live in nice areas, as in like out in the middle of nowhere. So I think I'm going to be trying to take advantage of that. So if you're listening, friends who I'm talking about, I shall be inviting myself this summer. Those are my plans.
A tour of the country houses.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wonderful.
Well, it's so lovely to speak with you and to meet you and hear about all of this from your perspective. Thank you so much.
Oh,
Yeah.
cheers. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
All right.
Our pleasure. Or my pleasure? Whose pleasure?
Our pleasure.
Okay. Yeah.
It's a pleasure.